Case 1. Jim Jones. Over 900 people dead in a single day. Men, women, and children lying motionless in the oppressive heat of the Guyanese jungle, their lives ended by a man they called father, a man they trusted with their souls, their savings, and their children's futures. Don't be afraid to die. If these people land out here, they'll torture our children, they'll torture some of our people here, they'll torture our seniors. We cannot have this. This is the voice of Reverend Jim Jones on November 18, 1978, commanding his followers to commit what he called revolutionary suicide. The death tape captures nearly an hour of unthinkable horror as parents poisoned their own children with cyanide-laced flavor aid before taking their own lives. This wasn't supposed to be how the story ended. Jim Jones began as a champion of racial equality in 1950s America, adopting children of different races and preaching radical love in segregated Indiana. He fed the hungry, housed the homeless, and gave hope to society's forgotten. Thousands followed this charismatic minister who seemed to embody Christ's message of compassion. But somewhere between the pulpit and the jungle, the preacher became a predator. The shepherd became the wolf. The man who promised salvation delivered damnation to nearly 1,000 souls who trusted him with everything they had. We didn't commit suicide, we committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world. How does a civil rights activist become America's deadliest cult leader? How does a man of God orchestrate the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history? The answer lies in understanding how divine authority can become the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we investigate the most shocking betrayals of trust that expose how easily divine authority can become a license to kill. If you're fascinated by true crime documentaries that reveal the darkest depths of religious manipulation and murder, hit that subscribe button right now. Jim Jones wasn't born a monster. In 1955, he founded the People's Temple as a beacon of hope in racially divided Indianapolis. Preaching a radical message of integration when most churches remained segregated, he adopted children of different races, creating what he called a rainbow family that challenged America's racial barriers. Thousands flocked to hear this charismatic pastor, who seemed to embody Christ's message of equality and compassion. But Jones harbored a darker ambition. By the 1960s, he began claiming supernatural powers, staging fake healings and declaring himself the reincarnation of Jesus, Buddha, and Lenin. He gradually shifted from Christianity to what he called apostolic socialism, using religion as a tool to promote his political ideology while positioning himself as the ultimate instrument of God's will. The temple's relocation to California in 1965 marked the beginning of Jones's transformation from pastor to predator. He became increasingly paranoid about government persecution and nuclear war, convincing followers that only he could protect them from the coming apocalypse. His sermons shifted from love to fear, from hope to desperation. In 1974, Jones began constructing his ultimate trap in the jungles of Guyana, a remote settlement called Jonestown, where he could exercise absolute control over his followers' lives. He promised a socialist paradise free from American racism and persecution, but delivered an isolated prison where escape became impossible and descent meant death. The end began on November 14, 1978, when Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in Jonestown to investigate reports of abuse and captivity. For 4 days, Jones maintained his facade of benevolent leadership, but when several families attempted to leave with Ryan, his carefully constructed paradise began to crumble. On November 18, 1978, Jones ordered the murder of Congressman Ryan and his delegation at the nearby airstrip. As gunmen shot the visitors, Jones activated his final plan, a mass murder he cynically called revolutionary suicide. armed guards forced parents to poison their children with cyanide-laced flavor aid, while Jones commanded from the pavilion speakers. "The children are not crying from pain, it's just a little bitter tasting," Jones lied as children convulsed and died in their parents' arms. Those who resisted were shot or injected with poison. In less than an hour, 918 people were dead, including 304 children who never had a choice. Guyanese troops discovered the carnage the next day, bodies arranged in family groups, couples holding hands in death, children cradled in their parents' final embrace. Jones was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head, a coward's escape from the hell he had created. The Jonestown massacre remains the largest single loss of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster until September 11, 2001. Entire families were eradicated, communities devastated, and survivors haunted by the guilt of trusting a man who transformed divine love into mass murder. Case 2. David Koresh. Vernon Howell seemed like an unlikely messiah when he arrived at the Branch Davidian compound near Waco, Texas, in 1981. A high school dropout with a passion for music and an encyclopedic knowledge of biblical prophecy, he gradually seized control of this Seventh-day Adventist splinter group through charismatic preaching and strategic manipulation of the aging leadership. By 1990, Howell had legally changed his name to David Koresh, claiming the biblical names of King David and Cyrus the Great. He declared himself the final lamb mentioned in the book of Revelation, the only person capable of opening the 7 seals that would trigger the end times. His followers believed he alone possessed the divine authority to interpret God's final plan for humanity. Koresh's theology became increasingly dangerous as he prepared his followers for an apocalyptic battle with the government, which he branded as the forces of Babylon. He took multiple wives, including underage girls, claiming divine mandate to father the 144,000 elect mentioned in Revelation. Simultaneously, he amassed an arsenal of weapons, converting semi-automatic rifles to full automatic and stockpiling ammunition for the coming Holy War. By 1992, federal agents had identified Koresh's compound as a serious threat. Reports of child abuse, illegal weapons modifications, and tax evasion prompted the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to prepare search and arrest warrants. But Koresh had been expecting this confrontation. He had prophesied that government forces would attack his community as part of God's end times plan. On February 28, 1993, over 80 ATF agents attempted to serve warrants at the Mount Carmel compound. Koresh had been tipped off about the raid, and his followers were armed and ready. A fierce gunfight erupted, killing 4 federal agents and 6 Branch Davidians in the opening moments of what would become the longest law enforcement siege in American history. For 51 agonizing days, FBI negotiators attempted to convince Koresh to surrender peacefully, while tactical teams surrounded the compound. Koresh used the siege to validate his prophecies, telling followers that the government assault proved they were living in the final days. He alternated between promising to surrender and declaring that God had not yet given him permission to leave. On April 19, 1993, FBI agents launched tear gas into the compound to force a surrender. But Koresh had prepared his followers for martyrdom, teaching them that dying in battle against Babylon would guarantee their place in God's kingdom. As federal tanks punched holes in the building's walls, fires began spreading throughout the wooden structures. The compound became an inferno within minutes, trapping 76 people inside, including 25 children. Koresh and many of his followers died from gunshot wounds before the flames reached them. Evidence suggests they chose death over capture, believing their martyrdom fulfilled biblical prophecy. The fire's exact cause remains disputed, but Koresh's theology of holy war and divine sacrifice directly led to the tragedy. The Waco siege became a rallying cry for anti-government extremists and a cautionary tale about the dangers of apocalyptic religious movements. Koresh's ability to convince educated, intelligent people that dying in battle against federal agents was God's will demonstrates the terrifying power of combining biblical prophecy with paranoid delusions of persecution. Case 3. Shoko Asahara. Chizuo Matsumoto was born partially blind in rural Japan, a disability that would shape his twisted path to becoming one of history's most dangerous religious terrorists. Adopting the name Shoko Asahara, this charismatic mystic founded Aum Shinrikyo in 1984, blending elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christian apocalyptic prophecy into a deadly cocktail that would terrorize an entire nation. Asahara claimed supernatural powers, including the ability to levitate and see into past lives. He declared himself Christ and the Lamb of God, prophesying an apocalyptic war between Japan and the United States that would end with Aum ruling a purified world. His followers, many highly educated scientists and professionals, were convinced by his seemingly profound spiritual insights and dramatic demonstrations of psychic abilities. The blind prophet developed a perverse interpretation of Buddhist karma, teaching that killing unbelievers was actually an act of mercy that prevented them from accumulating more bad karma. This doctrine of Poa transformed murder into a sacred duty, convincing his followers that they were saving souls by ending lives. Asahara specifically targeted those he deemed obstacles to Aum's divine mission. Aum's violence began with surgical precision in November 1989 when cult members murdered lawyer Tsutsumi Sakamoto, his wife, Satoko, and their 14-month-old son. Sakamoto had been representing families trying to rescue loved ones from the cult, making him a hindrance to Aum's growth. The family was abducted from their home, killed, and their bodies buried in remote mountain locations where they remained hidden for 6 years. Asahara's prophecies of global war weren't just spiritual visions, they were operational plans. Using the scientific expertise of his educated followers, Aum established sophisticated laboratories to develop chemical and biological weapons. They produced sarin gas, anthrax, and other deadly agents, while Asahara proclaimed that these weapons would fulfill God's plan to eliminate the unworthy and establish his divine kingdom. The cult's most horrific act occurred during Tokyo's morning rush hour on March 20, 1995. 5 Aum members carried plastic bags filled with liquid sarin onto subway trains serving central Tokyo, puncturing the containers before fleeing at stations. The odorless, colorless nerve agent quickly vaporized, killing 13 people and sending thousands to hospitals with severe poisoning symptoms. The subway attack paralyzed Tokyo and shocked the world with its calculated precision and innocent targeting. Japanese authorities launched the largest criminal investigation in the nation's history, eventually arresting hundreds of Aum members and uncovering the full scope of the cult's murderous activities, including multiple assassination attempts and plans for larger chemical attacks. After decades of legal proceedings, Asahara was executed on July 6, 2018, along with 6 other cult leaders. His death marked the end of a man who had convinced intelligent, educated people that committing mass murder was not only acceptable, but holy, a divine commandment from Christ himself to purify the world through terrorism. Asahara's reign of terror shattered Japan's sense of security and trust in religious authority. His ability to transform Buddhism's peaceful teachings into justification for chemical warfare demonstrates how any spiritual tradition can be corrupted when placed in the hands of a charismatic psychopath claiming divine authority. Case 4. Jeffrey Lundgren. Jeffrey Lundgren appeared to be a devoted family man and faithful Mormon when he moved to Kirtland, Ohio in 1984 to serve as a tour guide at the historic Mormon temple. But beneath his religious facade lurked a narcissistic predator who would transform a small group of followers into accomplices in one of America's most shocking ritual murders. By 1987, Lundgren had been excommunicated from the Mormon Church for his increasingly bizarre interpretations of Scripture and his claims of receiving direct revelations from God. Undeterred, he convinced a small group of devoted followers that he was a true prophet, whose teachings superseded traditional Mormon doctrine. He taught that they were the righteous remnant, chosen by God to restore the Church to its original purity. Lundgren's divine revelations conveniently required his followers to surrender their financial assets to support his prophetic mission. The group pooled their resources to rent a farmhouse in Kirtland, where Lundgren established absolute control over every aspect of their daily lives. He claimed that God spoke exclusively through him, making questioning his authority tantamount to rejecting God himself. Drawing from obscure Mormon historical teachings, Lundgren developed a perverted doctrine of blood atonement, claiming that certain sins could only be cleansed through the shedding of blood. He taught his followers that God had commanded them to perform a sacrifice of atonement to purify their religious community and unlock spiritual power necessary for the coming apocalypse. Lundgren identified Dennis and Cheryl Avery and their 3 young daughters, Trina, Rebecca, and Karen, as the designated sacrificial offerings. He convinced his followers that the Avery family was spiritually unrighteous and that their deaths were essential to God's plan. The family had been loyal followers who had given everything to support Lundgren's ministry, making their selection particularly cruel and arbitrary. On April 17, 1989, Lundgren lured the unsuspecting Avery family to the farm under the pretense of a group meeting. His followers had dug a pit in the barn floor, preparing what they believed was a holy altar for divine sacrifice. One by one, the family members were forced into the pit and shot execution style, Dennis first, then Cheryl, followed by their 3 terrified daughters aged 15, 13, and 6. After the murders, Lundgren told his followers that they had successfully completed God's commandment and that their obedience had pleased the Lord. The bodies were buried in the barn pit and covered with lime and dirt. For months, the group continued living at the farm, believing they had performed a sacred religious duty rather than committing cold-blooded murder. The murders were discovered in January 1990 when investigators, tipped off by former cult members, excavated the barn floor and found the family's remains. Lundgren was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death for orchestrating the killings. He was executed in 2006, finally paying the ultimate price for convincing others that God had commanded him to murder an entire innocent family. Lundgren's case demonstrates how religious authority can be weaponized to justify the most heinous crimes imaginable. His ability to convince intelligent, devoted people that murdering children was a holy act reveals the terrifying vulnerability of those who surrender their moral judgment to charismatic leaders claiming divine revelation. Case 5. Yahweh ben Yahweh. Ulan Mitchell Jr. transformed himself from a struggling ex-convict into a self-proclaimed deity who would terrorize Miami's streets throughout the 1980s. Adopting the name Yahweh ben Yahweh, meaning God, Son of God, this charismatic leader founded the Nation of Yahweh, a black supremacist religious sect that used Old Testament vengeance as justification for a campaign of racial murder. Yahweh's theology combined elements of black Hebrew Israelite beliefs with his own twisted interpretation of biblical prophecy. He taught his followers that black people were the true Israelites, and that whites were white devils created by Satan to oppress God's chosen people. This racial hatred became the foundation for a religious movement that would claim divine authority to commit acts of shocking violence. Within the Nation of Yahweh, members could achieve the coveted status of wearing white robes through a horrific initiation ritual. Yahweh commanded his most devoted followers to prove their loyalty by killing white devils and bringing back body parts, typically an ear, as proof of their obedience. This macabre requirement transformed religious devotion into a license for racial murder. Throughout the 1980s, Yahweh's followers conducted a systematic campaign of terror across Miami, targeting white victims for ritualistic murder. The cult was linked to at least 14 killings, with victims often found mutilated and missing body parts that had been collected as trophies. These weren't random acts of violence, but calculated religious ceremonies designed to demonstrate absolute submission to Yahweh's divine command. The FBI launched an intensive investigation into the Nation of Yahweh's activities, using undercover agents and informants to penetrate the organization's inner circle. Federal investigators documented a clear pattern of racially motivated murders ordered by Yahweh himself, with detailed testimony from former members who described the ritualistic nature of the killings and the religious justification provided for each act of violence. In 1992, Yahweh and 15 of his followers were charged with federal racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of the cult's murderous activities, including testimony from former members who had participated in the killings. While Yahweh was never convicted of murder itself, he was found guilty of conspiracy charges that carried severe federal penalties. Yahweh received an 18-year federal prison sentence for his role in organizing and directing the murder conspiracy, though he maintained his divine status throughout the trial and continued claiming innocence. The conviction effectively dismantled his organization and ended his reign of terror over Miami's communities. Yahweh ben Yahweh died in prison in 2007, taking his twisted theology to the grave. His death marked the end of a man who had weaponized racial hatred and religious authority to justify some of the most brutal murders in Miami's history. His legacy serves as a chilling reminder of how spiritual leadership can be corrupted into an instrument of systematic racial violence. The Nation of Yahweh's campaign of terror left lasting scars on Miami's communities, destroying trust between racial groups and demonstrating how religious extremism can escalate into organized terrorism. Yahweh's ability to convince followers that murdering innocent people was a holy duty reveals the dangerous potential of combining racial hatred with claims of divine authority. Case 6. Roch Theriot. Roch Theriot appeared to be a devout religious seeker when he formed a small commune in rural Quebec during the late 1970s. A former Canadian Air Force mechanic turned self-proclaimed prophet, he convinced 8 adults and their children to follow him into the wilderness, where he promised spiritual purification and divine protection from the coming apocalypse. Theriot established his commune, known as the Ant Hill Kids, in increasingly remote locations throughout Quebec and Ontario. Far from civilization's watchful eyes, he gradually revealed his true nature as a sadistic psychopath who used religious authority to justify horrific acts of torture and abuse. He declared himself a prophet and messiah, demanding absolute obedience to his every whim. Theriot's most twisted manifestation of power involved performing grotesque medical procedures that he claimed were divinely inspired healing rituals. Without any medical training, he conducted brutal surgeries on his followers using kitchen knives, hacksaws, and pliers. He removed teeth without anesthesia, amputated limbs for imaginary ailments, and performed abdominal surgeries that left victims permanently disfigured. The commune's children were forced to witness and sometimes assist in these horrific procedures performed on their own parents. Theriot justified the torture as necessary spiritual cleansing, teaching the children that questioning his methods meant rejecting God's will. This systematic abuse created a generation of traumatized witnesses who lived in constant terror of becoming his next surgical victim. Theriot's violence reached its ultimate expression in September 1988, when he murdered follower Solange Boislar during a particularly savage healing session. After punching her in the stomach repeatedly and performing crude abdominal surgery, he bludgeoned her with a hammer and slit her throat. He then forced the group, including Boislar's own children, to help dismember her body and dispose of the remains. Theriot told his traumatized followers that Boislar's murder was a divine test of their faith and obedience to God's prophet. He claimed that witnessing and participating in the killing proved their spiritual worthiness and dedication to his religious mission. This twisted logic kept the survivors trapped in the commune, too terrified and psychologically broken to seek escape. The commune's reign of terror finally ended in 1989 when Gabrielle Lavallée, one of Thériault's severely abused followers, managed to escape and contact authorities. She had endured years of torture, including having her arm amputated by Thériault, and her testimony provided crucial evidence of the systematic abuse and murder occurring in the wilderness compound. Quebec authorities arrested Thériault and charged him with murder and multiple counts of assault. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, where he continued claiming divine authority until his death in 2011. His fellow inmates ultimately delivered their own form of justice, killing the man who had tortured so many innocent people while hiding behind religious authority. The Anthill Kids survivors faced decades of psychological recovery from witnessing their parents' systematic torture and being forced to participate in acts of unimaginable cruelty. Thériault's case demonstrates how religious isolation can enable the most sadistic forms of abuse, when combined with claims of divine medical authority. Case 7. De Mombreau and Jury. Joseph de Mombreau and Luc Jury created one of Europe's most sophisticated doomsday cults by blending New Age mysticism, esoteric Christianity, and medieval Templar mythology into a deadly belief system. The Order of the Solar Temple attracted wealthy, educated followers across Switzerland, France, and Canada, with promises of cosmic enlightenment and spiritual evolution beyond earthly existence. The charismatic duo taught their followers that Earth was doomed, and that true believers could achieve transit to a higher existence on a planet orbiting the star Sirius. They claimed to be reincarnated Knights Templar, with secret knowledge of humanity's cosmic destiny, convincing members that their deaths would be a sacrificial purification that would transport their souls to this celestial paradise. De Mombreau and Jury specifically targeted affluent professionals, including doctors, lawyers, and business executives who could provide substantial financial support for their organization. They established luxurious retreat centers where members participated in elaborate rituals involving medieval costumes, sacred ceremonies, and apparent supernatural phenomena that were actually sophisticated stage tricks designed to reinforce their divine authority. The killing began in Cerchery and Salvan, Switzerland, where 53 Solar Temple members were found dead in coordinated murder-suicide events. Many victims had been shot, stabbed, or suffocated with plastic bags before the sites were set ablaze. The leaders had convinced followers that this fiery death would facilitate their cosmic journey, transforming murder into a sacred religious ceremony. Just over a year later, 16 more members died in a similar ritual fire in France, including several children whose parents believed they were granting them passage to cosmic paradise. The timing, synchronized with the winter solstice, reflected the cult's obsession with celestial events and cosmic significance, turning astronomical phenomena into triggers for mass murder. On March 20, 1997, 5 more Solar Temple members died in Quebec, Canada, including 3 children who were murdered by their parents before the adults committed suicide. This final killing spree demonstrated the cult's international reach and the lasting power of de Mombreau and Jury's cosmic death theology, even after the leaders themselves had perished in the earlier massacres. Authorities across 3 countries conducted extensive investigations into the Solar Temple's operations, uncovering evidence of elaborate financial fraud, weapons stockpiling, and detailed planning for the coordinated killings. The investigation revealed how the leaders had systematically prepared their followers for death, while accumulating millions in assets that would never reach the promised cosmic destination. The Solar Temple's reign of terror claimed 74 lives across multiple countries, destroying families and communities that had been drawn to the cult's promise of spiritual transcendence. The case demonstrates how New Age spirituality can be weaponized to justify mass murder when combined with charismatic leadership and claims of exclusive cosmic knowledge. Dimambro and Jurez deaths in the initial Swiss fires proved the ultimate falsehood of their cosmic theology. There was no transit to Sirius, no spiritual evolution, only senseless death, orchestrated by two con artists who convinced intelligent people that murder was the path to enlightenment. Case 8. Marshall Applewhite. Marshall Applewhite and his partner Bonnie Nettles began their deadly journey in the 1970s as spiritual seekers who claimed to be the two witnesses mentioned in the Book of Revelation. After Nettles' death from cancer in 1985, Applewhite transformed their UFO-obsessed theology into a suicide cult that would orchestrate one of America's most methodical mass deaths. Applewhite taught his followers that Earth was about to be recycled, completely destroyed and renewed by advanced alien beings called the Next Level. He claimed that the only way to survive this cosmic cleansing was to abandon their human containers, bodies, and ascend to a spacecraft that was, allegedly following the Hale-Bopp comet as it approached Earth in 1997. Unlike other cult leaders who used violence or coercion, Applewhite methodically prepared his 39 followers for what he called their graduation to the next level. The group, known as Heaven's Gate, spent months planning their departure from Earth, creating farewell videos, updating their website, and arranging their earthly affairs as if preparing for a long journey rather than death. As the Hale-Bopp comet reached its closest approach to Earth in March 1997, Applewhite announced that the time for their transition had arrived. The group rented a mansion in an affluent San Diego suburb and began their final preparations, convinced that they were about to shed their earthly vessels and join the spacecraft that only they could perceive following the comet. Over 3 days in late March 1997, the Heaven's Gate members carried out their graduation in 3 carefully orchestrated shifts. They consumed a lethal mixture of phenobarbital dissolved in vodka and applesauce, then placed plastic bags over their heads to ensure death. Each member was dressed identically in black clothing and Nike sneakers, with a $5 bill and quarters in their pockets for the cosmic journey. The suicide was conducted with religious precision that reflected Applewhite's obsession with order and control. Members were found lying peacefully on beds throughout the mansion, covered with purple shrouds, each having followed identical instructions for their departure. The scene looked more like a mass ascension ceremony than a tragic suicide, exactly as Applewhite had intended. San Diego police discovered the bodies on March 26, 1997, after receiving an anonymous tip from a former member who had received the group's farewell messages. The methodical nature of the deaths and the group's elaborate theological justification for their actions shocked a nation that struggled to understand how educated adults could voluntarily choose death based on UFO beliefs. Applewhite was found among the dead, having taken his own life after ensuring his followers had completed their transition. His death revealed the ultimate contradiction in his theology. If the next level truly existed and the spacecraft was real, why did the prophet who promised cosmic enlightenment end up as just another corpse in a suburban mansion? Heaven's Gate's website remained online for years after the mass suicide, continuing to spread Applewhite's toxic theology to new audiences. The case demonstrated how modern technology could amplify dangerous religious messages and how UFO beliefs could be weaponized to justify mass death when combined with apocalyptic Christianity and charismatic manipulation. Case 9. George McLellan. George McLellan operated in the shadows of rural Nebraska, leading a small but deadly white supremacist splinter group called the Church of God. This self-proclaimed prophet combined racist ideology with twisted biblical interpretation, claiming to receive direct divine commands that required his followers to purge their community of satanic influences and witches who threatened their spiritual purity. McLellan established his compound near Rulo, Nebraska, where he could exercise absolute control over his small group of devoted followers. He taught that white people were God's chosen race, and that Jews, minorities, and anyone who opposed his authority were agents of Satan who deserved death. His followers believed he possessed prophetic powers and could identify evil spirits inhabiting human bodies. In 1985, McLellan announced that God had revealed the presence of witches within their community who were corrupting their spiritual mission. He specifically targeted two men whom he accused of practicing witchcraft and serving Satan's agenda. His followers, convinced of their prophet's divine authority, prepared to carry out what they believed were holy executions commanded by God himself. McLellan and his followers subjected their victims to horrific torture, believing they could force confessions of witchcraft and satanic allegiance. The accused men were brutally beaten, mutilated, and tortured for hours, while McLellan demanded they admit to serving the devil. When the victims maintained their innocence, McLellan declared that their resistance proved their demonic possession. The group's violence reached its most horrific extreme when they murdered a 5-year-old boy whom McLellan claimed was also possessed by evil spirits. The child became a victim of the prophet's paranoid delusions and his followers' absolute faith in his divine revelations. This innocent death demonstrated how religious extremism can target the most vulnerable members of any community. After killing their victims, McLellan's followers buried the bodies on the compound property, believing they had successfully completed God's commandment to cleanse their community of satanic influence. The group continued operating normally, convinced that their murders were righteous acts that had pleased their divine prophet and strengthened their spiritual mission. Authorities eventually discovered the murders and arrested McLellan and his followers for the brutal killings. The investigation revealed the systematic torture and murder of innocent people who had been victimized by a delusional prophet's claims of divine revelation. McLellan was convicted and sentenced for orchestrating these religiously motivated murders. Though McLellan's group was much smaller than other cults, their willingness to torture and murder based on accusations of witchcraft demonstrates how religious extremism can produce devastating violence even in isolated rural communities. His case proves that the size of a cult doesn't determine its capacity for evil when led by a charismatic psychopath claiming divine authority. The McLellan murders shocked rural Nebraska and highlighted how white supremacist ideology could be combined with religious extremism to justify horrific crimes against innocent people, including children who had no defense against adults who believed they were carrying out God's will through acts of torture and murder. Case 10. Wayland Coker. Wayland Coker and his son Michael operated a small but incredibly deadly family cult in Florida during the late 1980s, convinced they were receiving direct messages from God about the approaching end times. This father-son team believed the world was ending, and that they had been chosen as divine warriors to eliminate demons who had taken human form, including their own family members. Michael Coker declared himself the Archangel Michael and claimed that God was speaking directly to him about the presence of demonic forces within their own household. The family's religious beliefs became increasingly paranoid and violent as they convinced themselves that Satan had infiltrated their lives through possession of their loved ones, requiring immediate divine intervention through holy execution. In 1990, Michael Coker's religious delusions reached their most horrific expression when he became convinced that his 8-month-old son had been possessed by a demon. Believing he was carrying out a divine commandment to save the world from evil, Michael decapitated his infant son with a sword, transforming a father's protective instinct into an act of unthinkable infanticide, justified by claims of divine revelation. After murdering his infant grandson, Wayland Coker turned his attention to his own wife, Michael's mother, whom he also declared to be possessed by demonic forces. The patriarch of this twisted family cult killed his wife, believing that eliminating these demons in human form was essential to God's plan for salvation and the coming apocalyptic battle between good and evil. The Cokers justified their family annihilation as a sacred duty commanded by God Himself. They believed they were participating in a cosmic war between heaven and hell, with their own relatives serving as battlegrounds for demonic possession that required violent exorcism through murder. This twisted theology transformed family bonds into spiritual warfare that demanded bloodshed. Authorities discovered the gruesome murders and arrested both Cokers for their religiously motivated family killings. The investigation revealed how two men had convinced themselves that God required them to murder their own innocent relatives, including an 8-month-old baby who represented nothing more than a father's psychotic break from reality disguised as divine revelation. The Coker case demonstrates how untreated mental illness can hijack religious faith and transform it into justification for the most heinous crimes imaginable. Their shared delusions about demonic possession and divine commands created a feedback loop that escalated from paranoia to infanticide within their isolated family unit. The Coker family murders represent the ultimate corruption of familial bonds through religious extremism. Their case proves that cult violence doesn't require large organizations or charismatic public leaders. Sometimes the most dangerous religious delusions develop within families where mental illness masquerades as divine revelation, leading to the murder of innocent children who trusted their fathers to protect them. 10 false prophets who weaponized the name of God to justify mass murder, child sacrifice, torture, and terrorism. The combined death toll is staggering. Over 1,200 victims murdered by leaders who claim to speak for God. These weren't random acts of violence, but systematic campaigns of murder enabled by religious manipulation. Every case follows an identical progression. Charismatic leader claims divine revelation, isolates followers from outside influence, demands absolute obedience to God's will, then reveals that God requires the ultimate sacrifice, human life. The victims trusted these men with their souls and received death in return. The red flags remain consistent. Claims of exclusive divine communication, demands for absolute submission, isolation from family and friends, financial exploitation, and the gradual normalization of violence as God's will. These predators specifically target our deepest spiritual needs, corrupting humanity's search for meaning into justification for murder. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable questions about faith, authority, and human vulnerability. Have you encountered religious leaders who claim exclusive access to divine truth? What warning signs have you observed in your community that might indicate dangerous spiritual manipulation? How do we protect vulnerable people from charismatic predators who use God's name to justify the unjustifiable? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how society can better identify and stop these religious predators before they claim more innocent lives. Subscribe to Savage Case Files for more investigations into those who betray our deepest trust to commit humanity's most heinous crimes.